Tell me his name again.
Thanos. He's a plague, Tony. He invades planets, he takes what he wants, he wipes out half the population. He sent Loki. The attack on New York, that's him.
Alright, did that seem familiar? Probably, right? But most likely not for the reason I want to focus on. Okay, how about this?
Some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with.
Things still not completely clear? Well, alright, I have one more example that should make the pattern plain to see.
We called him Baba Yaga, the boogeyman. Well, John wasn't exactly the boogeyman. He was the one you sent to kill the fucking boogeyman.
Now, I think we are cooking with fire. So, we just watched 3 very short scenes from 3 very different movies. But of course, they all have one thing in common. They all hype up the villain. Part of what makes the antagonist for many great stories so effective and intimidating is the fear and respect they elicit from the heroes. The goal of protagonists is to stand at the center of a story and ferry the audience through the emotional rises and falls of the narrative. By and large, we are meant to walk in the shoes of the protagonist. So, by definition, if they fear the power and abilities that the antagonist wields, we will also feel that way. Having the main characters verbally state their trepidation with facing their antagonists has served as a key method of building up iconic villains such as Thanos, the Joker, and John Wick. Except, of course, one of those don't belong. John Wick isn't the villain. In fact, he is so firmly the protagonist that the whole movie is named after him. But he is definitely talked about like he is a villain.
The bodies he buried that day laid the foundation of what we are now.
Really, if a person only watched this scene between Theon Mafia Joy and his father, one would definitely come away from it thinking that John is as villainous as they come. But why? Why does the film dedicate this time to making the hero sound so menacing? Well, I think it's because the writers knew it was absolutely the best thing to do given the circumstances. And that writing choice, and what we could all learn from it, is what the rest of this video is going to be about. Almost without fail, through every client that I have worked with and every manuscript that I have edited, a central focus has been to make the protagonist interesting. Like I said before, a protagonist usually stands at the center of a story, and therefore carries the story on their shoulders. Because of this, it is very important to many writers to endear their protagonist as soon as possible to the audience, or at least make the main character likable early on. This is actually the titular subject of the late Blake Snyder's ultra-famous book, Save the Cat. Within, Snyder describes the usefulness of having a decisive moment where the protagonist proves they are worth rooting for as soon as they appear, or at least close to it. The example of such an action Snyder gave was saving a cat, an action nearly anyone could get behind. John Wick as a film does this exact thing, but with a bit of a twist. Instead of a cat, it's a dog, and everyone can get behind taking care of a dog.
Yeah, well, if you're asking me if I like wild animals slobbering all over me, then yeah, I guess I'm not really a dog lover there.
Wow.
Okay, maybe not everyone, because narrative techniques that focus on tugging on your heartstrings don't work equally on all people, but I think you get the point. The entire reason that we see John Wick with this puppy is to give us a picture of who he is as a person, someone we can understand and possibly care for. In fact, the entire introduction of this movie is geared towards that goal. The opening shows us John bloodied, bruised, and vulnerable. The opening moments continue on showing us that John was a loving husband, but is now coping with the difficult reality of losing the love of his life. This all culminates with John receiving this puppy as the last gift from his late wife, a final thing to remember her by. And while the literal save the cat moment is John taking care of the dog, the entire intro is one big save the cat moment. It's an orgy of evidence to impress upon us that John is a good dude who deserves our sympathy. The narrative is doing its absolute darndest to cast an emotional net that can capture as many people's hearts as possible, as deeply as possible. And it's doing that for two reasons. The first of which is so this moment hits hardest where it hurts most. John is beaten, his dog is killed, and it gets revealed that all of this happened simply as the aftermath of a chance run-in with a terrible stranger. All that positive regard the film spent the intro building up is cashed in here, and any person with a heart will at least feel a little bad at watching a puppy and a man get brutalized for no reason. But as I said, this is only one part of why the intro was set up this way. The other is to give narrative weight to this scene. This whole exchange between Boss Vigo and his son Yosef might honestly be the most important scene in the entire movie, and its contents are the complete inverse of everything that happened during the intro. Where the opening of the movie went out of its way to impress upon us a John that was vulnerable, kind, heartbroken, and protective, this scene educates us on an entirely different side of John, one that is murderous, ruthless, calculated, and efficient.
I once saw him kill 3 men in a bar with a pencil.
And the reason I think this scene is so important from a technical editing perspective is because it expertly lays the narrative bedrock for making John Wick a terrifying protagonist, something that the movie relies on for the rest of its runtime. This is accomplished not just by the information about John's past, which is honestly terrifying on its own, but who the information comes from. It's not John who gives his own character-relevant details. It's the gangsters, the villains. And because of how modern fiction has commonly handled delivery of character information, this makes John seem like the villain. Let's dive into why. Typically, one of the most important jobs a narrative has to accomplish early on is establishing the antagonist and the threat they pose. There are two very common ways to accomplish this. One way is to showcase the villain's methods and ruthlessness through a scene of action. This shows the audience firsthand how dangerous and threatening the antagonist is. Christopher Nolan did this with both the Joker and Bane, and the MCU accomplishes this with villains like Killmonger. The second method of establishing the villain's threat is a bit different, as it revolves around words more than action. Many times, the main characters, or even the protagonist, will relay the dangerous aspects of the villain through dialogue.
If he gets his hands on all 6 stones, Tony,
You could destroy life on a scale hitherto undreamt of.
Now, both of these methods, the action-based and the dialogue-based, are really just smoke and mirrors to disguise the narrative construction going on underneath. Let's focus on the dialogue method for a moment. When a main character talks about how powerful or dangerous or threatening a villain is, it is meant to set up the traditional struggle of a story: overcoming conflict. All good stories revolve around a character, generally the protagonist, overcoming some conflict. And that conflict is created by the antagonist. So for our main character to overcome the conflict, they therefore have to overcome the antagonist. Pretty simple stuff. But for the antagonist to be overcome, that means by definition, they must be in an elevated position relative to the protagonist. To say that in a less pretentious way, the villain needs to be better than the hero. Stronger, faster, smarter, wealthier, whatsoever the narrative conflict demands. Typically, whatever the strengths the protagonist has, they should be ineffective at dealing with the antagonist. There wouldn't be much of a conflict if the hero could save the day right away. A well-executed antagonist targets and highlights the weaknesses of the protagonist. When done right, this should cause the protagonist to confront their weaknesses, experience character growth, and rise to meet the challenge of the antagonist. And of course, the greater the difference in power between the protagonist and the antagonist, the greater the conflict and the greater the payoff if and when the protagonist ultimately succeeds. All in all, this is meant to say that when main characters talk about the threat of the villain, they are establishing the benchmark for who they have to overcome and surpass. And that is why John Wick, in this scene, feels so villainous. What seems like just simply dialogue is actually an inversion of traditional narrative formation. It's the antagonists fearfully establishing the threat of the protagonist.
John will come for you, and you will do nothing because you can do nothing.
our hero character is depicted as a single-minded, murderous force of nature that cannot be reasoned with.
Let us not resort to our baser instincts and handle this like civilized men to move on.
And it's the villains who have to try to change and evolve to overcome him.
Tasker crew. How many? How many do you have?
And I think this is the key to what makes John Wick so terrifying as a protagonist. This isn't a situation like in Taken, where the main character is a highly skilled killer, but the villains brush him off.
And I will kill you.
Good luck.
This is a situation where the main character is a highly skilled killer, but the villains are horrified of him.
That fucking nobody is John Wick.
And what that does for anyone who engages with the fiction is let them know they should be horrified of John Wick 2. It's an incredibly simple but effective way of making the protagonist terrifying. However, this isn't a carte blanche endorsement of this narrative technique. There are distinct dangers and weaknesses associated with it, and to avoid them, very specific writing fail-safes need to be utilized, all of which John Wick as a film employed in the intro. And believe it or not, we actually already touched on them. Let's say you want to use this technique, so you want to convince the audience of the threat of your protagonist by having the villain fear them. This can only work if the audience understands the villains to be threatening first. If the villain is weak or meager or unintimidating or worse, nondescript, them being scared of your protagonist doesn't mean much. But if your villain is hardened and ruthless, their fear of the protagonist is much more impactful. So in the case of John Wick, the film needed to establish the threat of the antagonist before making them fearful of John. And that's exactly what it did. This scene is an example of a villain introduction through action that I was talking about, and it allows the audience to get a sense of how dangerous and twisted these gangsters are. They are the kind of people who don't think twice about breaking into your home, killing your dog, and beating you senseless just because they felt like it. The film is banking on you thinking these are scary people, which would make their eventual fear of John exponentially more meaningful. But that still isn't enough, because you don't want your audience to be only terrified of your protagonist. You want your audience to be invested in, if not hopefully root for, your main character. However, most people don't like cheering on a merciless mass murderer. So how do you make your protagonist terrifying, but also sympathetic enough to excuse their killing? Well, you do what John Wick did. Make the killings as justified as possible. Generally, this is either done through moral justification or emotional justification. Moral justification is what superhero and action movies do. The hero can kill their enemies because it is in service to the quote-unquote greater good. Emotional justification is what John Wick does. The narrative creates a situation where the audience can sympathize with and understand why John is killing. This is the value of the movie's Save the Cat intro. The movie is telling you that John was a peaceful, mourning widower who wasn't malicious, but was simply pushed to the edge. The other side of the emotional justification is making the villains as easy to root against as possible. This is why Yosef, to put it scientifically, is such an insufferable dick. We want to see him get what he deserves, and that creates a situation where we are willing, if not happy, to know that John is coming after him so mercilessly. The allure of the rest of the film isn't just seeing if John Wick lives up to his legendary reputation. It's waiting to see if the villain gets the comeuppance that we so desperately believe he deserves. John Wick is a terrifying protagonist because the villains fear him, and he has the skills to back it up. But we also root for John because the narrative has convinced us on an emotional level that while we might not act on it, some part of us understands John's desire for revenge and wants to see him succeed. The anger and fear and regret in Viggo's eyes as he comes to grips with how grave a mistake it was for his son to cross John is all the film needed to do to kick into full gear. If any of you writers out there have been struggling with ways of making your own protagonist feel threatening or powerful, this narrative technique might be right up your alley. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you might have learned something along the way too. If you like what you heard, consider subscribing for more content, or if you really want to help out, consider supporting the channel on Patreon for early videos and other cool perks. Links will be in the description. Or if you want something more casual, check out the second channel, link for that below too. Again, thank you all for watching to the end. As always, it was a pleasure, and I will talk to you all again soon.